Fantasy and desire, on the face of it, are the same thing. They're both about certain situations which turn you on or don't turn you on. But this week I want to dispel that myth. Fantasy is not in reality whatsoever, whereas desire is. And depending on the context, depends on whether you actually are turned on by it. And one context is if it is fantasy or it is desire. So I want to explore that in this video. Before I get into that, my name is Andy. I talk about sex education topics on this channel, which is a really good reason to stick around. I hope you learn a bunch of stuff while you do. So this video was triggered by a video that Hannah Witten put out about a week and a half ago. And she talked about the books which turned her on. Now there's a bit of furore around some of those books, and I'm not going to go into that, but what I am going to do is talk about why certain things turn you on in fantasy, whereas they never turn you on in desire. And it's all to do with context. If you do want to watch that video, then I'm going to stick a link up there. It is age restricted, so you will have to log in with your Google account if you're not already. And you will have to be over 18 years old. So yeah. So firstly, let's do some definitions here. Fantasy is when you are reading something or you're imagining something and you have a situation where either you're putting yourself in there as the first person, or you are indeed a third person looking on. But both of those things are not reality. They are in your head. They are either stimulated by literature or some other thing, maybe television, theatre, whatever. But it's not necessarily what you're reading or what's going on in front of your eyes. It's about what is in your head and the things that you are imagining that's happening. The difference between that and desire is things that you want to do physically. So you actually want to consensually do certain things with your partner or with a group of people or whatever. And they don't have to be sexual things, by the way. There's sexual desire, obviously, which I'm going to be talking about in this video. But you desire to meet your friends up in a bar, but right now you can't do that because of the COVID restrictions. So, but you still have the desire, even though you can't do it. In the same manner, you might have a fantasy about that happening and imagining what might happen. But of course, it's in your head and not happening in reality. Now, fantasy and desire aren't necessarily the same thing and aren't necessarily linked. In fact, often they aren't, because the context is different. So in fantasy, the context is that it's happening in your head. You may be placing yourself in a story or something like that. So you might have the fantasy of being James Bond, for example, and being a Secret Service agent and being in those stories and having it off with Miss Moneypenny. In reality, apart from the fact that that isn't going to happen, you might not want to do that. You might not want to put yourself in danger of being a Secret Service agent, and because, apart from anything else, it's much more mundane than you see in a James Bond film. Now, I have fantasies, sexual fantasies, which I don't want to do in reality. One of the things which I sometimes have brought up in this channel before is I kind of class myself as heteroflexible, because I have sometimes fantasies of doing things with the same gender as myself, with men. Although I would say it's more me putting myself into a situation than it is of a fantasy of me. So I'm living vicariously through a fantasy rather than fantasizing myself in that kind of situation. But I don't want to do that in reality. I have no desire to do that in real life. So this is why sometimes I might say I'm heteroflexible and other times I'm going to say I'm straight, even though actually I could probably identify as both. But you can see that there are some fantasy there which doesn't relate to in real life desire. And the same goes for literature, for on telly, watching theatre, doing anything like that, watching a film. So there's the James Bond example which I just had, but you could be watching something like The Blair Witch Project, which is a very famous horror film, and you think, in fantasy, you'd be running through the forest, getting chased by somebody. You might even be sexually aroused by that kind of thing, but you don't want to do it in reality, do you? It's like you're actually going to die. You don't actually want to do it, do you? That's a very good example as well. So you're getting sexually turned on, potentially in the fantasy, by that situation, by it being in your head and putting yourself in that situation, but you wouldn't be sexually turned on if there was actually somebody trying to murder you. That's the difference, right? So therefore, the context makes something sexy. Not actually being there makes the action of running away from somebody sexy. But being there in reality would not at all. It would horrify you. This is why sometimes if you read a story where the protagonist is somebody which isn't the same gender as you, isn't the same sexual orientation as you, or both, then you can get turned on because you are placing yourself in the story. You are being the character that is being portrayed. Or you take the context away from the characters. So the interaction going on between two characters, you kind of forget who the characters are and you place yourself and somebody maybe more appropriate for that interaction, but within the same context, in the same story. So potentially you've got two women texting each other in a sexy way. Well, obviously that's not me because I'm a man, but what I might do is take those sexy texts and place it in a fantasy of me and another woman, which I do like. So I'm a man and there's a woman I'm texting and we're sending those same sexy texts. And in that fantasy, I'm getting turned on by that, the texts themselves, not necessarily the characters. And this is important because if you could never be those characters and you get turned on by that situation, then that's fine because it's not you liking the situation, it's liking the things in the situation. So obviously that cannot play out in real life and you can't get turned on by that. You have to be one of the characters in reality, otherwise there's no way you know about this interaction between two people. Somebody would have to tell you the story, and if they are private texts, as they might be in the story, then there's no way you knowing that. So you can't get turned on by that situation in reality because it would never transpire. Now the classic one, and I'd like to put a content warning before we go any further, I'm going to talk about non-consensual sex here, so if you don't want to, so you can skip to a time code, which I'm going to put on screen now. But a classic thing which people fantasize about but would never want to happen in reality is rape, okay? People have rape fantasies. They have in their head that they want to be dominated by somebody else in a non-consensual way. And now sometimes they are the person who isn't consenting, sometimes they are the other person in a dominant position. And this is quite a common fantasy where there is a dominant and submissive relationship between two people. But it is a fantasy, not a desire. Now, of course, there are some situations where you have dom-sub relationships, but they are consensual, even if you're doing non-consensual things, if you see what I mean. So it's consensual non-consent. You are role-playing the non-consensual bit, but the actual thing is consensual. That's not quite the same thing, even though you are playing that out. It's, again, a kind of fantasy in reality. You are making a situation where you're actually consenting to the whole thing. So the non-consensual bit is a fantasy, but you are actually consenting to it. So it's, it's different. But the point is that it's really common to have this thing, which is, it's not allowed in reality. You'd never do it in reality. It would never be a thing which you even get turned on by in the real life. But in your head, while you're reading something, while you're watching something on telly, well, you might get turned on by it, and that's fine. It's something which some people get ashamed by, and they shouldn't, because you can't actually control what you get turned on by. As much as people might think you can, you can't. Some people have things which turn them on, and they turn them on really fast, and they can't stop it. As soon as they're in there, that's it. Being turned on is a subconscious thing. It's not a conscious thing. Have you ever tried to get turned on? Have you ever constantly thought, I need to get turned on now? It doesn't work. So this difference between what is fantasy and what is desire, the two different contexts, this is related to something called arousal non-concordance. So sometimes you are turned on by things in your head, but not turned on in reality. So just because you are turned on in your mental state doesn't mean that you're physically turned on. And just because you're physically turned on doesn't mean you're turned on in your head. Those two things can depend on the context of when you see things. Conversely, there is arousal concordance. So when those two things do match up, basically, when you have something in fantasy which you are also turned on in reality, or something which arouses you in your head, which also arouses you in your genitals. However you experience these things, it is totally normal. There are loads of people that experience it in more or less the same way as you do. Also, if you don't experience things in this way, that's also normal. If you're turned on by almost everything, that's kind of normal. But desire, actually wanting to do something, is something which is conscious. You know, it is something which you have to make a conscious choice about. So arousal is not conscious, but desire is conscious. I'm sure that you have lots of comments about this, so please do leave them in the comments below. I will be very interested to read what you think about this. Do give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. You can do that down below as well. Subscribe because I make regular videos, and click the little bell icon so you next know when I upload. And hopefully that means I will see you next time. Bye-bye.